In 1987, a game was created that revolutionized the industry. This game would take the tried and true overhead perspective and put it on its side for better play mechanics and simultaneous two-player total carnage. The name of the game was Contra, or Grisor, or even Probotector depending on what part of the world you were located in. Why was the name changed all over the world? Who was the box art modeled after? So grab your weapons and get to the chopper, because this is the history of the Contra series. The year is 1987 and Konami designer Koji Hiroshita is designing his next arcade game. He was a fan of the Hollywood run-and-gun action movies that featured Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone. He was also a fan of Commando and Akari Warriors, two arcade games that took inspiration from these movies. He loved the two-player action Akari provided, but what he didn't like was the overhead perspective. He wanted to create a run-and-gun action game, but this time using a side perspective. So if you take all these elements and mix them together with a little bit of aliens thrown in, you get the arcade game Contra. Konami had already produced a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up entitled Green Beret, or Russian Attack here in the States. While the perspective is from the side, and its actions are a bit limited. Mr. Hiroshita also wanted to include an over-the-shoulder viewpoint level to break up the monotony of the side-scrolling sections. Contra was released into the arcades in 1987 by Konami. Konami was no stranger to arcade hits, having already released a number of arcade classics including Track and Field, Gradius, Boot Camp, and Russian Attack. The success of these games would pale in comparison to the worldwide popularity that would come to the Contra franchise. You take on the role of Lance Bean, which I believe he's related to this Bean, or Bill Reiser, as they set out to take down the evil Red Falcon organization. The game is a simultaneous two-player run-and-gun shooter which revolutionized the genre, similar to what Double Dragon did for the beat-em-up. You have a fire button and a jump button to help you avoid enemy fire. When your character is at a standstill, you can pull down to crouch. You start out with a standard machine gun with unlimited fire. However, you can upgrade your weapon by destroying the flying item capsules or the red pillboxes. There are a total of 4 weapon upgrades, including a rapid-firing automatic machine gun, a laser gun, a fireball gun, and a spread gun that shoots 5 individual bullets in different directions. Each power-up is labeled with the first letter of its name. For example, spread is labeled as an S, F for the fireball, etc. You will need all the extra firepower you can get, because if you take one shot, you lose a life. The game takes place across 7 levels with 3 varying viewpoints. There is the side perspective, the 3D over-the-shoulder vantage point, and finally the fixed overhead shooter. The game was great success in the arcades, so a number of conversions were released. Initially, the game was released just for the 8-bit line of computers. One major change that happened was the name of the game. In the 80s, the name Contra referred to the Iran-Contra affair, which was a political scandal that involved the U.S. selling weapons to Iran to fund the Contras. Now, since the name Contra was so politically charged at this time, the name of the home computer ports that were released primarily in Europe was changed to Grisor, a completely made-up name that wouldn't offend anybody. The first thing that pops out when looking at the box art for the home conversions of this game are the 2 muscle-bound meatheads on the cover. The original arcade flyer showed 2 different characters posing for Lance and Bill, but when the game was released for the home market, they decided to redo the cover. Most people instantly recognized Arnold Schwarzenegger on the left side, but mistakenly referred to the character on the right as Sylvester Stallone. As you can see, both of these were taken from the movie Predator and are both stills of Arnold Schwarzenegger. The Spectrum is the first version we're going to look at, and it's a pretty good attempt. Yes, there's a definite lack of color which makes it seem like you're missing your prescription glasses, but as far as the speed goes, it's right up there with the arcade game. The scrolling is fairly smooth, as is the animation. There is also music and sound effects while you play, which is a bit unheard of on the Spectrum. The playability is good for what it is, but it doesn't quite feel like Contra. The level layout is different from both the arcade and the NES, and the game is pretty difficult. The Amstrad version is up next, and it is the most impressive of the 8-bit computer ports. First off, this game doesn't scroll, which does hinder the gameplay just a bit. However, everything else is top shelf with detailed, colorful sprites and smooth animation. The speed of the gameplay is very close to the arcade original. You even have the same power-ups and level design from the arcade. There is no music, but the sound effects are adequate. An extremely well done conversion. Up next is the good old Commodore 64 version. Even as a child, I thought, can't the Commodore do a better version than this? While it's a competent shooter, it just doesn't feel like Contra. It feels like something our old buddies from TierTech Software put together on a Friday afternoon. The ropey animation and collision detection play a major factor in the game getting such a low score. You also can't redefine the jump button, so you're stuck with having to use the spacebar. The visuals are muddy and not very detailed. The music and sound effects are excellent though. It's just too bad the rest of the package isn't quite as good. The Japanese MSX2 computer got a pretty good port of the game. There is no scrolling, but the speed of the gameplay is very close to the arcade original. The animation is nice and smooth, and the music is very good. The game has been simplified, making it more of a mashup between the NES and arcade game, with shorter levels but more of them. The weapon system has also been simplified, with some weapons missing entirely. Most people are familiar with this game from the NES conversion. Rather than do a straight-up conversion of the arcade game, they decided to expand the game by adding new levels. The gameplay mechanics have also been refined, which makes it feel even tighter than the arcade game. The sprites and animation are very detailed with excellent playability throughout. The simultaneous 2-player action was brought over as well, and you are going to need it because this game is hard. To aid you in your quest to defeat the Red Falcon organization, you could always input the so-called Konami code, which would give you 30 lives instead of 3. Contra was also released for the Famicom system in Japan, but this time utilized a special VRC2 mapper which was designed by Konami that enhanced the game. Extra cutscenes as well as new background animations were created for the game. Another Contra variant was released in Germany, but not until 1990. Due to its strict laws on video game violence, the characters of Bill and Lance had to be changed to robots, and the title of the game was changed to Probotector. Aside from the robots, this was essentially the same as the USA version. Since the game's inception 32 years ago, there have been numerous sequels and attempts at reviving the series. I'm not going to cover every game, otherwise this would be a 9-part video, but I will cover the highlights. Super Contra was released into the arcades in 1988. The game takes the alien invading motif and ups the ante by 10. The game is essentially the same as the original Contra, taking place across 5 levels. It does retain the side-scrolling format, but switches to an overhead perspective for certain levels. Most of the weapons are the same except for a bomb gun which replaces the flame gun. The game was ported to the Amiga, MS-DOS, and the NES with the title changed to Super C. They didn't want to confuse players with the Grisor name, and the name Contra was still taboo. In 1991, the first portable version of Contra was released, and that was Operation C for the original Game Boy. Who would have thought that an underpowered black and white handheld could pull off such a good version of the game? Not me, but it's a really good conversion, especially considering the hardware. This is basically a stripped down version of Super C on the NES. The machine gun power-up and the laser rifle are both missing, leaving only the spread shot and the flame gun. There is a new homing bullet gun that will actually chase down the enemies. Unfortunately, there is no multiplayer option, but it's still a great Contra game. In 1992, released for the Super Nintendo, was Contra 3: The Alien Wars. This was a high watermark for the series and is truly one of the greatest Contra games ever released. The game was developed with the original arcade team providing input. The game uses numerous examples of Mode 7 and sprite rotation to produce an immersive arcade boss rush experience. The music will also change as the stage progresses, giving it a much more cinematic feel. They incorporated heavy drum beats and orchestral chords whenever the tension was high. The bosses are huge, multi-jointed creatures that actually fill the screen. There are plenty of weapons available, including a nuclear weapon that will wipe out all enemies on the screen. If you're a fan of Contra and have never played this game, you owe it to yourself to check it out. Contra Hardcore was released for the Sega Genesis in 1994. This was Konami's one and only Contra game for the system, and boy did they knock it out of the park. The game looks very similar to another Sega Genesis run and gun game, and that is Gunstar Heroes, but only cranked up to 11. This is without a doubt one of the most gorgeous Genesis games on the market, and also one of the hardest. At least this time you can carry up to 4 weapons at once, allowing you to switch to whichever one you want on the fly. You can also select one of 4 characters to use. There are branching paths with multiple endings, which greatly improves the replay value. The variety of levels is simply amazing, and your jaw will drop at some of the special effects that are used all throughout. If you feel this version is too difficult, be sure and try out the Japanese version, which includes a life bar, allowing you to take 3 hits before you die. After a couple of disappointing entries on the PlayStation 1, the series returns to form with Contra Shattered Soldier on the PlayStation 2. The game returns to the two-dimensional style of gameplay, and this finally feels like a next-gen version of Contra. In my opinion, certain games should always be done in the 2D perspective, and I believe Contra is one of them. Although the game is strictly 2D, the game uses full polygon graphics instead of sprites, which makes the visuals absolutely gorgeous. The controls are very similar to Contra 3 on the Super Nintendo, except there are no power-ups in the game. You are equipped with 3 permanent weapons that can be switched to at any time. The weapons are a heavy machine gun, a flamethrower, and a grenade launcher. There are multiple endings in the game, but the ending you receive is depending on how well you play the game. The game introduces a hit rate system which gauges the number of enemies killed as a form of performance metric. The higher the hit ratio along with the minimization of lives lost is imperative to receive the better ending. It's a cool little feature that makes the game all that much better. Contra 4 was released for the Nintendo DS in 2007. The game chooses to ignore the newer play mechanics implemented and returns to the power-up system found in previous games such as Contra 3 on the Super Nintendo. Speaking of, the game feels like a sequel to Contra 3: The Alien Wars. It uses both screens of the DS for a much wider play area. You have a grappling hook which will let you zip between screens. Similar to the arcade version of Super Contra, if you pick up the same weapon twice, you will get an improved version of that weapon. The game is fairly long, clocking in at just over an hour of play straight through. This is one of the best portable versions of Contra on the market. To celebrate Konami's 50th anniversary, the Contra collection was released on Xbox One, PS4, Nintendo Switch, and Steam. This is a collection of the best Contra games available, including the arcade, NES, Famicom, Super Nintendo, Game Boy, and Genesis. The collection retails for around $15, so this is well worth the money spent if you're trying to scratch that Contra itch. And that about wraps up the history of the Contra franchise. As I mentioned, I didn't cover every game, but I did hit the highlights and left out the lowlights. The Contra franchise revolutionized the genre with its simultaneous two-player run-and-gun action, and any game that came out after it owes it a debt of gratitude. If you are a fan of these types of games and have never tried the series, you owe it to yourself to check it out. Be sure to grab a mate to play with because the series is very hard and you're going to need all the help you can get. Or you can just cheat and use the Konami code like I did. If you like my videos and want to support me on Patreon, please click the link below. Also, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. It's the only way my little channel can grow. Leave a comment below whether you liked or disliked the video. Thanks for watching.